afternoon, everyone. My name is John Moorhead. We're here on the second of our Passivhaus Association of Ireland Autumn CPD series. We're going to start in a minute. Numbers are rolling in. We've quite a large participant number expected today. So we'll give them a minute before we actually kick in. But while we're waiting, I'd like to just thank some of the PHAI personnel who've been involved in putting this together. Yvonne Coakley, Helena McElmeal, and Caroline Ashbrady. I'd also like to particularly thank Brian Flax of Core Systems, who's been really helpful in polishing things up. We got through the first of our autumn series by the skin of our teeth, and hopefully this will be a more polished affair. We're going to have a poll at the end to try to see what sort of content that you'd like to hear in the future, because we're getting quite a significant take up on this. We'd also like to thank our patron members, Ecological Building Systems, you're all familiar with, Milan, and Kernahan Distribution. Without these guys, we wouldn't be able to bring this to you. We'd like you to also maybe pop across at the end of this to phai.ie, which is our main website, and you'll see where all the upcoming events are, etc. On the 30th of November, we have another webinar. We've got Suzanne Winkle and Bob Ryan, and that's going to be really interesting for people who are already certified Passivhaus designers or tradespeople, and how they can maintain their accreditation. Also going to look at Bob's launching some information in relation to new Irish thermal bridging details, which are going to be really useful. They're typical details that are being used in the Irish construction market. And then another date for your diary, again, lunchtime, 7th of December, we're going to have Helena McElmeal, who's with us today, and Tim, who's going to talk about how Passivhaus can deliver on the climate challenge. Tim Ortels with ACB, and has written the pH ribbon tool that we all use. So that's going to be really good. On the 7th. So today, I think we've over 60 now already, and I'm conscious that people will have things on after lunch. I'm going to start the introduction. And we have today a person who many of us are very familiar with, Anne-Marie Fallon. She's an associate director and CEPH designer at Architype, who are leading UK practice in Passivhaus and all things sustainable, I would say. She's working with the Architype team on developing an innovative process to create compatible workflows for Passivhaus and BIM implementation and streamlining the delivery of certified projects. She's got vast knowledge and is very modest in relation to this on thermal bridging and hydrothermal software, as well as all general building energy modeling software. Successfully delivered the award-winning and UK's largest Passivhaus residential scheme, Agar Grove, and was involved in quality and technical design reviews for the UK's largest Passivhaus secondary school, the Harris Academy, Sutton, the UK's first Passivhaus Plus school, Hackbridge Primary, and the UK's first Passivhaus Plus office, which is Bicester Eco Business Centre. Anne-Marie also brings expertise in Enerfit, the Passivhaus standard for retrofit, and has delivered Architype's first Enerfit project in 2017, and one we all are familiar with, which is the first Enerfit ever in Ireland way back in 2011. A UCD graduate and one of the first lucky tranche of certified Passivhaus designers who attended the Strathclyde Uni course back in 2009. I welcome you here, Anne-Marie. Thanks a million, and look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Right, okay. Hi, everybody. You can hear me okay? That sound's coming through all right? Yeah, okay. All right, just let me share my screen, and yeah, you're happy that I can just move straight into the presentation. Okay. All right, welcome everybody. And I do see there's one or two people from Scotland that are at the recent SPAV conference. So this is a variation of that presentation. So bear with me, in particular Jamie, as we move through this. So thanks for having me along today, and it's always really amazing to come back, and I'm always asked, am I coming back? But come back and be part of the Irish Passive House community today as well. So just a little bit about my background. I've been in the UK for 10 years now. I came over as a sole trader, started Architype in 2016, and I do a lot of kind of educational give back as well in relation to either external examining at part 3 and part 1 and 2 levels, as well as looking at environmental modules across some of these curriculums. And we're working with REBA and Co-Action at the moment as well in relation to setting up how curriculums in the universities in the UK can incorporate Passive House into their undergraduate curriculums by the addition of an additional set of training, so similar to the Passive House training. So all very exciting stuff that's happening in the background of the day-to-day work. As John mentioned, I was involved in the first certified Retrofit project in Dublin 10 years ago now, so I got certified, but the kind of gems of the beginning of it started in 2010, which was Little Architects at the time, which was a really exciting kind of seminal project to be involved in. And I brought that kind of knowledge through, and I've always had an interest in a retrofit since. So who are Architype? Well, we're a practice of about 38-year-old practice with 3 bases now in Edinburgh. I've been involved in the last 3 years of developing the Edinburgh office from just 3 of us in 2019, all the way through COVID, working remotely and finally working back together again to a staff number of 32. And we also have our 2 existing bases in Hereford and London. And we have a consultancy, a sister consultancy that sits alongside this called Architype Perform, which looks at building aftercare, additional kind of master plan modelling, post-occupancy evaluation, and energy modelling, thermal bridging analysis, and that kind of thing as well. So a lot of our focus on our design ethos has been around evolving through lessons learned on our own projects actually over the last 15 years. So the last 15 years, we've had a real focus on Passive House delivery. And we also carry out post-occupancy on obviously other architects' buildings, clients' buildings, and kind of bring that all in-house in terms of lessons learned and trying to demonstrate improvement in design over the years. So our first or second generation Passive House schools have evolved quite significantly now into the schools designs that we're doing in Scotland at the moment and across the UK. So the context of Passive House and where it sits in net zero, I will be preaching to some of the converted obviously on this call, but the operational carbon aspect is where Passive House really has a really strong focus. And actually in the realm of whole life carbon, then I'll chat about that later on, by reducing the operational efficiency and improving that, we still have a significant whole life carbon impact that can be made on buildings. Passive House at scale in the UK has kind of come on in leaps and bounds over the years. You know, Passive House Institute was founded in 1991. We've had the Passive House Trust developing around the same time as PHAI has in Ireland, 2009, 2010. And we had plenty of one-off housing and affordable housing schemes over the years, but we've also had quite large building typologies being developed, right from the very first multi-residential housing schemes in Scotland, in Exeter, right through the first, second generation Passive House schools, business centres, archives, retrofit of tower blocks now, the first Passive House premium building in Enniskillen in Northern Ireland, which I technically are saying the UK, but feels like Ireland to me as well. And all the way up to the Passive House Leisure Centre in St. Sidwell's in Exeter, as well as some REBA Sterling Prize and REBA award-winning projects along the way as well. And quite a lot of those projects have been delivered by Architype. So for better or worse, we've been delivering a lot of the first typologies of their kind across the UK, which has been a really exciting journey. And the very last one there in the bottom right is the first certified low embodied carbon Retrofit project university building for University of Cambridge. And I'll touch on that later on in the call. So I'm focusing on net zero estates and the Scottish context as kind of part of my development of the Scottish office. And just to touch briefly on the policy drivers around net zero carbon in Scotland. So Scotland has been quite ambitious in its policy setting, and the councils in Scotland were amongst the first in the UK to declare climate emergencies. The Scottish Futures Trust, which is kind of the infrastructural funding body for Scottish government, has set and issued a net zero public sector building standard last year. For context, England is only just looking at issuing theirs this year, and they haven't talked to each other, which is quite entertaining. And more interestingly, into next year, that net zero public sector building standard is going to be revised to also include existing buildings and existing building retrofit. And what the Scottish Futures Trust has done in the new build non-domestic sector has developed outcomes-based funding metrics for buildings. So you don't just get handed a couple of £1 million to deliver a new school. You get drip fed that funding over a 25-year period as you hold that building to a high condition rating. And energy is a really big part of their funding criteria, that you have to satisfy a particular targeted delivered energy metric, which aligns very closely with the passive house delivered energy, final energy demand metrics would be. So without saying passive house, they're implicitly suggesting that there's methodologies out there to deliver this. And very shortly, we'll be looking at that when we look at retrofit over the next couple of years. A really important part of that in Historic Environment Scotland has been very seminal, and I've had in my historic involvement with Joseph Little been involved in some technical papers around the hydrothermal risk and all of the risks associated with retrofit. And all of that really underpins the care and approach to the methodologies that I'm going to discuss today with you. So we're all familiar with the kind of complexity of retrofit, that we have a huge amount of existing buildings, and even the buildings that are being built today, unfortunately, are at such a substandard level due to various quality and workmanship issues, etc., that they're at risk themselves of needing to be retrofitted again before 2050. And we also have the big issue of the design gap. So whilst we want to bring things through continuously from design to demonstrate that that building type is actually performing in reality, we end up, and there's evidence to prove this, and it's well founded amongst the passive house community, that we have a performance gap of potentially 2 to 10 times the predicted design energy demand, which is really, really significant. You know, we don't all want to be sat around in 2050 wondering why we're still having this significant energy intensity through the national infrastructure, or equally buildings that fail to perform and also could end up being health risk for occupants. So over the last 2 years, we've developed an approach using the Retrofit methodology, but also looking at the past 2038 methodology, which is set out in the UK for kind of a retrofit coordination role for non-domestic buildings in relation to how we would approach retrofit at scale. Because again, yes, we can do one-off retrofits, and every measure, every building we do is really meaningful and contributing towards the greater good. But actually, how do big public sector clients get their heads around how they can balance retrofit and renewable energy contribution in their overall estate? And you might have heard of Archie O'Donnell over recent months talking about the environmental social governance values that are coming out, and the increased transparency that investors and hedge funds are looking for now on actual performance. And I think this, if the investment funds are kind of leading this kind of evidencing and empirical led delivery of data, I think we as designers then also need to be responding to that and making sure that if we are retrofitting, or we're looking at scale, large scale retrofit strategies, that we are being realistic and making sure that we deliver on them with no performance gap. So, our approach to one-off buildings, the steps to that are around quite obvious statements, really, in terms of course, using less energy. How do we do that with the fabric first approach, but also occupant behavior changes? A really good understanding of how your building uses energy. And I think we have that nailed in the domestic context pretty well. We know how the demographic and behavior changes of occupants and how people use buildings, and we can get a good sense of what their gains are and losses are, and the kind of abnormals that sit within the residential context. In the non-domestic context, that becomes quite a new challenge, and the existing building fabric acts as an opportunity as well as a constraint. The operational demand reduction approach of looking at a deep retrofit also deals with the operational carbon reduction, of course, and actually similarly will also deal quite well with the whole life carbon aspects. And then only then is when we really consider renewables and whether we want to make that building something that is more active and generating more energy than it's using. If that's possible, we have the infrastructure capability to allow that to feed back into the grid, or we have battery storage to allow that to be stored on site or within a region. And then we're putting that investment forward because, yes, retrofit is expensive. The return on investment that we're looking at, if we continue to look at these spiraling energy costs, becomes quite attractive. But if costs kind of fade away again, as all the government forecasting trends predict over 30 years, that energy essentially becomes almost free, which I do not believe. This investment now is only going to get more expensive if we put it off any longer, as well as the energy costs going up quite exponentially. So how do we wrap that out and extrapolate that on estates? Well, understanding the building is a big thing for us. So there's a lot of light touch studies out there that just look at EPCs or SAP values and suggest measures of improvements without really understanding building typologies. So how we worked this through the example that I'm going to show you is really understanding the building and going in for a deep dive assessment at the very beginning. That rigorous methodology then that Passive House and Retrofit sets becomes a framework that we work in to deliver the concepts and the measures on the buildings themselves. And we use those quantitative benchmarks to make sure that we're on the right path, okay, so that we don't set standards without an awareness of building physics and knowing how buildings really should perform in a healthy, safe way, both for occupants and for the building fabric. In this case, then, we looked at several different typologies and modelled different options. So I'm going to go into the detail that we did this for Edinburgh City Council and several other councils at the moment across Scotland. And we chose some pilot projects to do an even deeper dive in to find out what the opportunities and challenges were. And I think one of the big challenges is with non-domestic projects in the public sector is really the multi-headed nature of governance in those departments. Or in those local authorities, for example, where you have several stakeholders all coming from different departments, all having a say in the end of the day in how something gets funded or put forward or instructed. And what we developed then was a kind of index ratio, the total performance criteria index, which looked at the key parameters that local authorities identified themselves and put a weighting against those. And of course, every department has a different weighting, and so it becomes quite a bureaucratic process, but a really much needed one to help that client become informed about why they're making the decisions they're making. And hopefully with this technical information, they're able to make more informed decisions. So that was a huge part of the process that I'm just touching on today, but really understanding the nature of the client and the client's push and pull factors is really important, and also understanding how the governance runs in those places and being able to demonstrate visually back to them what their decision-making process means for them. So the example I'm going to go through is with City of Edinburgh Council. Came to us and said, we have an asset management database in-house, we have an energy department, we have a capital programme team, we have all these teams that we know need to talk to each other, and Edinburgh themselves have made Passive House a requirement for all their new schools. It's written into policy, which is brilliant. And the funding, that outcomes-based funding relates to that. So you build a Passive House school, it has to meet an energy metric for 25 years, otherwise you don't get your funding year on year, which is phenomenal. And out of their estate of about 400 buildings across Edinburgh, 300 of them are heated or conditioned in some way. So other buildings are depots and storage areas, etc. So we focused on those buildings and got access to their asset management database, and created a number of different themes and typologies and worked with them to identify 12 buildings out of that 300 that were representative of the estate. So there's some abnormals in there, like very, very high heritage buildings in Edinburgh that didn't get included, but we were looking at the broad mass where the energy use intensity was, because of course their energy department actually had a great record of the energy consumption of all their buildings as well. So there was kind of quite a kind of informed client sitting behind the data already, and what they needed to do was extrapolate this out against several retrofit strategies. What we brought to the table then was looking at not just going, okay, here's the energy data from the billing for the last 5 years, let's just make a stab at, having a look at the building and seeing what's wrong. For all of those buildings, we carried out existing building air testing, thermal imaging, an element of opening up where it was safe to do so, because obviously there's asbestos and other concerns. We needed reporting to be up to date on some of the buildings before we're able to do that. As well as looking at the billing data from the last few years and consulting with the current users of the building. So that deep understanding of the building is quite a significant investment for a local authority to do, but it provides a really valuable benchmark for them that they can just apply across the wider estate in their decision making and thinking. Because really, you're going to spend, several billion, which has been quoted, to do just, a number of these buildings, a quantity of these buildings. As part of this study, you really want to understand exactly what you're doing. So retrofit isn't just a one brush all approach. It's something that needs to be, unfortunately, from a detention point of view, but it's a good thing from a building point of view. It needs to be a bit more bespoke, a bit more specific to the project. So we established a baseline. We used PHPP modeling to do that, and we looked at those various correction factors to deal with what the current average temperature of the building is now, which over a year is probably only about 14 or 15 degrees, and what that uptake is to bring that temperature up to a more comfortable position. And of course, the temperature is very low because that's an average yearly temperature, so including nighttime temperatures. We have a very uninsulated building with very poor air permeability of about 12. This particular nursery was in an architectural conservation area, and being able to identify where that heat loss is coming from and what the buildup of the component buildup of the walls and building out fabric are, as well as having the actual air tightness data for the building, was really important to us. How each of these 12 buildings then fitted into the methodology? Well, we looked at what you might be familiar with in terms of an energy retrofit plan, or a whole building retrofit plan is some of the common terminology for this, and the Passive House Institute do use this terminology as well, so we didn't invent it, as it were. The do nothing approach is keeping all these buildings on gas and just dealing with the existing energy demand. The MEP, or the option 2A and B, are more services focused. So saying, right, okay, we want to decarbonize these buildings, so we're just going to throw loads of money at the heat pumps and see, can we, decarbonize and say that we're green by just changing the heat source. 2B is a little bit of a fabric upgrade, insulating lofts and things like that, stuff that might be, available from a budgetary point of view. Because the context in Scotland is that there's funding available for swapping over to heat pumps, but there's actually no funding availability yet for looking at fabric first intervention. So this was a direction by the client. Let's look at what heat pumps only do first, because we have the political parties in the background, shouting out about decarbonisation, when they actually know that they want to focus on retrofit. And then as we move across 3A, 3B, and then finally kind of option 4 or variations of option 4, how close we can get to Enerfit. And a proportion of the buildings couldn't quite get to Enerfit in terms of just being a little bit, from a practicality or buildability point of view, not really possible. But the traditional Enerfit route, so hitting the 25 kilowatt hours per meter square per year. However, it was possible to look at some of the listed building exemptions or look at certification by component, and to allow us to almost get there on some of those buildings. Down on the left-hand side just shows the different measures of intervention we looked at. So we actually had a design team, not a full design team, but we had a QS, Curry and Brown, and we had an engineering firm looking at services, Harley Haddo, both based in Scotland. So we worked up strategies for the building to really get transparent costing, as much as costing could be transparent right now with inflation and everything else, and realistic buildable services strategy. So using the 3D visualization asset models that we were able to get as part of the surveying process that the local authority did, as well as working with the QS on focusing on energy improvement costs. Okay, so we looked at energy improvement costs, not wider costs that might have done to do with suitability, i.e. is this school fit for purpose, because maybe classrooms need to be made bigger or something like that. And we kind of said, well, that's not really related to the energy measure, but that of course would have to be considered for any retrofit of a building, the suitability of it, the adaptability of it. So we tried to isolate what the retrofit cost was as much as possible in that work with QS. And what that led us to was a series of different types of graphs and analysis, this one just of the heating load. And we can see that even with just some minimal options, option 2B there, the third one over, we're getting to just even a little bit of insulation, 35% improvement. But of course, what we're really trying to push down towards is the almost, the greater than 70% improvement that we can see with going down a deep retrofit route. And this was quite an eye-opener for the client to look at, well, if we don't actually, change our fabric, we're still going to have the same pressure on the infrastructure in Edinburgh. So the other strand of thought in Edinburgh is that part of the city will be run on heat networks, which is controversial in itself. And then the other part of the city is decarbonised on heat pumps, depending where the utilities have the greater or lesser capacity. So it's part of this much bigger debate about infrastructure that we probably all should have been talking about 10 years ago to meet any of these standards by 2050, because they involve a huge, a much bigger picture thinking than just the buildings on their own. Another graphic was we looked at whole life carbon analysis and embodied carbon analysis. I think a common myth out there at the moment is that we add embodied carbon to buildings, we're stripping out glazing, we're doing all these things, and we're not actually dealing with the whole life carbon picture. And I think it's pretty clear here over the 60-year profiling of this building and the other, with 25 buildings now that we're doing as part of this wider Scottish case study, that we are looking at least a 65 to 70% reduction in whole life carbon emissions based on dealing with that operational case from a fabric first approach. And what feeds into that a little bit as well is obviously the decarbonisation of electricity from the current government emission factors. But there's fairly compelling evidence out there about, from the data that we have on product materials, that we are getting a reduction. So as I just mentioned, I think we're up to about 25 now. So this graphic needs probably one or two more added to it. And what the councils and local authorities have agreed to do in Scotland between them, I think we're working with about 6 of them now across Scotland. There's only 32 in the country. Is that they're going to share the data between them and share all the cost information, all the strategies, and all the different typologies. So there's a range of different buildings, you know, from Victorian 1930s through to the 60s and 70s, and then even a building that's been built in the last 4 or 5 years, which is performing really, really badly because of a catastrophic airtightness failure, are all part of the study, and they're all going to be shared between the councils as part of a bigger knowledge share base for ultimately Scottish government, but specifically for these local authorities. And so far, it's also generated a bit of interest from Scottish government, and 3 of these projects are going to go forward as pathfinder projects for setting a new existing buildings retrofit energy target, being mindful of all the other considerations that we have to be sensitive about in retrofit. And of course, you know, Edinburgh being a heritage city, we've consulted with Historic Environment Scotland, and they're broadly supportive of looking at proposals to make some changes so that listed buildings actually have a future, and we don't end up with the kind of ghost city where buildings become so prohibitively expensive to run or so uncomfortable to be in that they become unsuitable to continue using in a sustainable way, you know, or an intensified way. So the initial discussions at that level have also been really positive. And there's just some of the Johnny Walker Bond building on the left and one of our secondary schools on the right in Edinburgh that we're looking at that have listed status that are being developed at the moment as well. So what we're trying to do as well is establish what trends there might be across this analysis. So we can see again here that on the buildings we're working through, we can see that there's still compelling evidence the whole life carbon is addressed through retrofit. And also we're looking at cost impacts. So of course, cost is what everyone's interested in. And I don't have any good news on that, I'm afraid. It does cost money to retrofit buildings, regardless of whether you're focusing on deep retrofit or not. But what's been quite interesting is what the costs and what that debate has started generating within the local authority. So just switching to a decarbonised heat source like a heat pump on certain buildings can be up to 50% of the capital cost for the energy measure improvements themselves. So, you know, if we reframe that and think, well, you know, is it better to decarbonise a little bit later or look at demand reduction, or how does that sit within a kind of capital budget or funding context? And some of that data was quite interesting. Decanting and temporary accommodation has the potential to kill the retrofit strategy. One local authority actually has created a decant school in a particular region, so that over a 10-year period, they're going to decant their entire student populations into this school building. And other local authorities aren't so lucky. They've sold off all their capital assets apart from the ones they get now, and potentially they could look at decanting into office spaces in the locality, because offices, you know, the work from home, the flexibility post-COVID now, they can actually maybe consolidate some of their assets and you know, change the use temporarily to provide for schools. But of course, that comes along with its own costs and complexities. Through this study, our thoughts with QS, of course, Curry and Brown, is that we want to drive down the cost of retrofit to 50 to 80% of what new build cost is. So of course, there's a lot of risk priced into these things, and it's not an exact science, but that would be quite a success, I think, if we can be quite savvy about how we retrofit. But of course, every building is slightly different. And yeah, the common sense approach, what we haven't been able to cost in is obviously if we do this over time. So we've just picked costs within the kind of 18 months from this particular financial quarter and looked at inflation as it stands right now. And we're trying to normalize that across all the projects, because we've started this 2 years ago. And of course, inflation's changed radically over that period. And we're just trying to keep the case study up to date, basically, from the earlier schemes. The big operational cost risk, which is really compelling, is the fact that if we just do nothing and we just swap in the heat pump, potentially with energy costs for electricity at the minute, we're going to have a 74% increase in operational costs. Now, of course, that would have to run for several years to kind of, if you start looking at payback on that extra over to do your energy retrofit as well as your normal retrofit of the building, but it becomes quite compelling. And even to the extent on this particular one building, because all buildings had a different trend, you're still going to pay a little bit more changing from gas to electricity. So again, that's the UK Green Book, the current costs. There's other models out there used by local authorities that predict a less volatile cost prediction. But of course, that prediction has to be thrown out the window at the moment with no energy cap on non-domestic building energy spend at the moment in the UK, and just the astronomical increase in costs that many people in the industry have discovered. I suppose the other risk of that is that if the public sector is funding projects from taxpayers' money, surely we should be a bit more accountable in terms of how we then future-proof that further taxpayers' money by looking at reducing the operational costs of our entire public sector estate. And I think that's the conversations that have kind of started to evolve around this study. There's always that competing tension, of course, between capital costs and operational costs. And sometimes it can look attractive and sometimes it doesn't look so attractive. And I think we need to get away from just always looking at the cap cost without looking at the OPEX costs alongside it. But that is obviously quite a challenge when the budget holders are responsible for what they're issuing funding for. And really interesting was to read about the climate accounting economics that Lord Stern has produced for the UK. So it was a 2006 report and a 2021 report, which really kind of disputes how government look at future financial operational spend and throws in, the catastrophic impacts of the climate emergency on top of all of that as well. So really interesting and worth to read. Final few minutes, because I know we want to give quite a bit of Q&A time before you all disappear at 2 o'clock. So what does that all mean? We've just done this big study. We have experience in retrofit. It's a discussion. That study I've just presented isn't really completed. We're finishing 3 or 4 buildings between now and the end of the financial year, and of course it'll be disseminated, and probably a wider kind of more comprehensive umbrella paper will be issued towards the middle of next year. But how have we implemented this in practice already? So I bring you from Scotland down to Cambridge to an old 1930s telephone exchange building for the University of Cambridge. And they wanted this building to be a creative hub, enterprise type centre for the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. So it's a postgraduate building, but also a kind of enterprise hub. And they really wanted the building to embody exactly what the department stood for. And I would say on the left, the greenest building is the one that already exists. I would add to that and is retrofitted, and a credit to John Gilbert Architects for that quote, because I think that's what we need to look at with the existing estate. And what was really interesting about this building was that it was in an architectural area of architectural conservation, but we had quite a toil with the planners, the conservation planners, about upgrading it to a full retrofit project. And it's like Marmite, you'll either love it or hate it. But the most fundamental change, the biggest fundamental change to this building externally was the treatment of the windows. And we did a significant technical study to bring people through that. And I'll go into that in a bit of detail in a second. So the brief really was to create a space for the next 100 years that could be an operational, functional office space, an education space for the university. You can see the top image here. It's quite dank, dark colours, ventilation brought through the ceiling of the room to kind of and a heating as well to buffer the kind of drafts from the single glazing, blinds pulled down because of the cold, kind of uninspiring spaces. And the bottom space is the very stripped back version that we went with, where we were trying to remove ceilings, centralize the ventilation rather than bring it out to the windows, because we get better thermal comfort with Passive House because of the fabric being upgraded, and looking at low VOC and potentially some recycled fit-out furniture in there as well. So the circular economy came into this a little bit. It also had to represent good value for money, but also the brief really asked us to challenge conventional norms. So the whole brief was a big challenge. It was a big question mark about what we could achieve with a building of this era. And I suppose if you imagine if it was a listed building, which it isn't, how acceptable or not acceptable were certain parameters. and for the project to be an educator, of course, itself. So there's, a whole presentation I could do on that building itself, but I just want to focus on the windows today. There was lots of complexity involved in trying to retrofit internally and trying to get the balance right with materials. But the existing sash windows were the most contentious part of this building to retrofit and refurbish. You can see some examples of them there. We did look at green building stores, mock triple glazed, passive house certified, I think, window, which is on the right-hand side. But we really felt that actually we were just mimicking history, and that, truth and honesty about materials and putting our architect hat on, we felt really, to sustain the building longer term, actually, is there a rethink needed about the window design? Because of course, even these Georgian windows evolved over several centuries. They were, simpler panes, for example. There was a fashion of painting them all black and green and brown at a certain point in history as well. And actually, are we in this other moment where we changed the vernacular? We also felt that, like, the extra thickness where you saw the triple glazing on the right-hand side wasn't really representative or even sympathetic to the existing single sash windows on the left. So there was a whole debate about that, a whole process where we went through looking at that triple glazed window in detail. And we also assessed it from an energy demand point of view and an average daylight factor point of view. So we were able to drastically increase the average daylight factor for the building by removing all of the panes and looking at a single pane option, while simultaneously getting us down to just below the retrofit standard as well. And I'll show you the 5 options we looked at here. So with the existing condition, we had the recessed triple glazed mock sash window. Obviously, the windows got recessed to line up with the internal insulation line. We looked at kind of single mock sash without the glazing bars, and we looked at exposing and then hiding the frame on a kind of simple passive house inward opening window arrangement. We presented all that to the planners, and what we also did was look at the total carbon life cycle impact of the 2 windows themselves. Okay, so of course, embodied carbon of glass and windows is really, really high. So I think as architects, we need to be super conservative about using vast expanses of glass in new buildings. But also there's a kind of, a sensitivity around taking windows out of very high grade, high integrity, high significance listed buildings as well. So this building was unlisted, so we got to really test the water with conservation planners. And we compared the 2 here, and I think just some of the stats I've pulled out, because unfortunately the data for embodied carbon of windows and frames is not really as well developed as some other products that are out there. So the technology is developing all the time. We use our own in-house software, Ecolab, to look at this, but I think the big thing for me was that between the 2 windows, we had a little bit more increased life cycle carbon on the one that didn't have the frame in it, because glass is a slightly higher body carbon. But overall, option 5 offset that operationally by almost 10% over the 100 years that we looked at, and you got all the additional benefits of increased daylighting, internal gains that reflected back into the operational energy demand. And overall, there was less than 1% difference between the total embodied carbon when we pulled out the embodied carbon data from the whole life carbon data. So again, we're kind of evolving this study. I mean, and, we looked at those 2 options because they were the 2 options the planners were kind of most interested in looking at. But yeah, the evidence is quite compelling, even when you get down to the granular level, that actually overall, when we look at 100-year lives of buildings, these small changes and concerns and anxieties at times around embodied carbon can be trumped by the reduction in the operational energy demand. I think because none of us are going to be around in 100 years' time, it's very hard to visualize how important that is when we're so busy dealing with upfront carbon emissions in buildings as well. So finally, the building itself. The prediction was that we needed to, the requirement from the client was that we'd get to at least 75% whole life carbon emissions reduction, and we had 82% because we used a lot of low embodied carbon materials internally, like diathanite, clay and lime plaster finishes, and also wood fiber insulation. So we tried to go as hydrothermally safe and healthy as possible within that building as well. And also that building exceeds LETI and I think also potentially the REBA 2030 whole life carbon targets that have been set, even though it is a retrofit building. So, technically it doesn't need to fully comply with that because that's a new build standard. So just a couple of images just to finish off of the interior. So again, you can just see the new window setting. We strip back the finishes. So, you kind of see the services, you see the interventions, and that idea that in theory could all be decoupled and removed in the future if needed. just an image around the back, like the dormers were very, very tricky to retrofit. So there's an element of kind of reinstating some of those. And you can see that we just, had this quite slim aluminium frame kind of celebrating the recess and celebrating the kind of ratio that's on the building, but with quite a modern frameless insert in behind it. But I feel, doesn't take away from the building too much. But yes, I mean, aesthetically, it's quite a different direction. And I know people have quite strong views on that if it was listed. Just a couple of the images. And yeah, the main conclusions really, I mean, the study is still ongoing. We've got several buildings now that are completed or almost complete with the same kind of strategy. I think, for the converted people on the call, demand reduction is always going to be key. That's why we're such passionate advocates of Passive House. We need to establish the future longevity of our heritage assets. So, keeping the single glazed windows, maybe not bothering to update a listed building, may mean it becomes uninhabitable from either a cooled or a overheating reason over the next 100 years. And really, is that the best thing that we can do for our heritage? Surely keeping our heritage being used and consolidated and within the community life is a more kind of socially sustainable target we should be aiming for. One size doesn't fit all, so we found a huge variety across 24 buildings in terms of retrofit strategy, but there are trends emerging, and hopefully that kind of establishes into kind of a playbook almost of retrofit trends, and there's several of those out there at the moment as well. And yeah, I mean, I think the final thing for me is the evolution into the more conservation context is that kind of, Ruskin versus Duck conservation conversation, that we do need to look at our heritage assets as well and challenge what is possible for those heritage assets and what's most kind of suitable for them over the next 100 years and not just now. Because I think my greatest kind of example of this is the tenement buildings in Edinburgh and Glasgow. The Public Sanitation Act was set in 1848, and before that, people just put their excrement on the streets and threw their refuse in the gullies in the middle of the streets, much like in Ireland. And the councils since 1848 spent about 150 years retrofitting sanitation across the country, and we had buildings whose heritage, you could argue, was destroyed by having to retrofit toilets and drainage and all sorts of stuff to them. So where they're a key valued kind of fondly looked at piece of heritage architecture now, we kind of ignore the soil vent pipes and all sorts of stuff. So how do we see these buildings in the next 50 to 100 years? I think that's the big thing that kind of continues to challenge my thinking anyway as well. But I think retrofit has to be underpinned by something really valid like the Passive House or retrofit benefit standards to really stand the test of time. And that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. That was really, really informative. I picked up a few questions along the way, and we've got two from participants, which we'll go to as well. I was wondering, you were telling us one of those properties had an air permeability of about 12. What was the sort of average of the first stab of air permeability, the first tranche of buildings you looked at?
So the 1930s buildings performed better than the buildings from the 80s, which is quite interesting. So we had the 1980s typically sat an air permeability now between kind of 10 and 15, and the 1930s were anything from 8 to 12 in terms of air permeability. And the most shocking one was a building that was completed in 2018 that had a declared permeability of practical completion of 3.2, but actually we couldn't get a reading on the fan when we went back in the summer. It was a permeability of 18 to 20. So there's quite serious issues coming out about recently completed award-winning buildings, and because the clients noticed the really high energy bills. So generally, the higher energy bills with the leakier, much higher energy bills per meter squared with the leakier buildings.
Yeah.
And we had one interesting incident where there was a very mild but windy winter versus a cold, still winter in a particular region. And the bills were higher on the milder, windy winter because the building was so leaky. It was basically getting wind washed, which again was just quite interesting to identify those kind of trends.
Yeah, and I suppose that leads on to if one can address air tightness in some of these buildings rather than going down the MEP route, you can actually achieve an awful lot and also improve comfort very quickly. Plus, probably save the building fabric.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Might just start here. We've got one from Ewan Perry. For 25-year funding model, was consideration given to including an extended defects liability period under construction contracts to incentivize the contractor to remedy any defects preventing compliance with operational efficiency requirements that might lead to the procurement authority not receiving central government funding? This is a key issue on the LEIP 2 projects this person is advising on.
So we've been involved in helping establish the target generally, but I think when some of these questions have come back to me, and I think that's definitely a question for Stephen Long, Ewan, from SFT. My understanding is that the liability sits with the local authority, and then it's up to them within the framework agreements how they set their limited liability. We know as architects, of course, in the UK, our limited liability, I think it's been extended for 30 years now, I think between 15 and 30, just in June this year. So there's huge change because of the kind of Hackett report and Cole reports in terms of how we're going to be applied into building liability anyway. So again, I'm not 100% sure how to answer that because it is to do with the framework. Yeah, I do agree. I think it's probably not clear, but also it's the complexity with something that's not performing in the future could also be user-led and behavior-led. So really the local authority needs to have a robust building kind of operational, and as you know, the standard information plan, the BIM level 2 level of handover now that's been looked at in Scotland is phenomenally detailed in order to kind of mitigate user issues at the other end as much as possible.
And commissioning and monitoring as well.
Yes,
at the early
yes,
stage,
the commissioning.
rather than waiting 25 years. I don't think we'd wait that long normally. You figure it out fairly quickly.
They've managed to build in, a 12 to 18 month monitoring, post-occupancy monitoring requirement in as part of the LEAP funding requirements as well. So the learning estate investment funding for schools, I think is what Eunice referred to there.
I think the next one, next question spins off your comment on liability of the design teams. This guy, Stephen, I'm currently working on projects in domestic schools and hospital sector, and I think it's in Ireland. When the architects are asked about thermal bridging, they don't know what they're talking about. They say the details comply with the requirements, probably the accredited details, maybe, but don't have proof of it. And when pressed further, they can't prove it. Considering thermal bridging requirements have been law for years and years now, and the many architects not fully aware of the requirements, how will that impact the retrofitting of buildings? How much of the impact would be poorly designed junctions having existing buildings when it's being upgraded?
So, I mean, absolutely. I think the literacy of, I'm an architect and I can say this, but the literacy of our own, of that profession out there about building physics and the impact of thermal bridging is really, really poor. And there is so much out there. There's so much learning that we can do without having to go on a course, and to get better at that information. And I completely agree with you. In our kind of assessments and looking at the database that we have, you could be looking at up to a quarter of the heat loss, even when you retrofit, becoming a thermal bridge, in the building if they're not addressed. Because obviously, as we add insulation, we're actually making the thermal bridges worse because we're creating even more cold spots in the building. So there's a huge, hyperthermal risk around not getting the air tightness and ventilation, of course, and the insulation right. And I think, I absolutely agree. I just don't think we're aware enough about it yet.
No, it's really worrying in that the funding regimes here, there was 50,000 offered there only last week, I think, for derelict buildings to bring them back in, and 30 grand for buildings that weren't occupied. And we're seeing funded buildings, getting funding, state funding, with no hygrothermal analysis, no air tightness testing before they go and do it. And then within a year or two, sheets of dry rot and mold everywhere, and there's nothing. It's really serious. Jamie Goggins from Mary, the Uni of Galway. I think I know Jamie in the climate scene from way back. How is the University of Cambridge building performance relative to the predictions? You noted a performance gap of 2 to 10 times between design and actual. What is the typical performance gaps for buildings that you've been involved in, e.g. between PHPP and actual measured performance in terms of energy consumption and indoor environmental conditions?
Okay, so Cambridge just completed this year, April 2022. So next summer we will have the first year of data from that building. And of course, the first year is the defects period where I expect there'll be a little bit of up and down and adjustment. Most of our buildings, nearly all of our buildings do actually exceed where we've designed them. So Harris Academy, for example, the secondary school was completed in 2018. We had an energy use intensity prediction, so like operational at the bill prediction of about 51 kilowatt hours per meter square per year. Its first year of occupation, now minding that it was 70% occupied, so it hadn't got to full occupation yet. Its first year of measured performance was at 32. So we more than exceeded the PHPP target. And the 2 to 10 times performance gap is generally the evidence that we've got from the post occupancies of other projects. One project where we had more electricity demand than we predicted was the Enterprise Centre for the University of East Anglia. So we've kind of 6 years of post occupancy monitoring on that project between different kind of funding initiatives. And the building actually was used, it was being used beyond its brief requirements. So it wasn't never meant to be used on Saturday and Sunday. There was people in, there was other buildings using and coming to the lecture theatre that hadn't been originally timetabled, and there was lots of evening events and conferences started to be held at the building. So whilst we were a bit worried initially, looking, oh my God, why in year 3 has the energy use gone up? When we actually went back to the client and realised, oh, they're using the building 30% more than what we all worked together to predict the normal university hours were, was quite compelling. So
yeah, that's part of its success, I'd say.
It's well liked building.
One here, I don't know whether you'll be able to answer this now. Where is it gone? When an existing wall is being upgraded, 2 default values could be calculated. One with the SBEM, which is what we use for non-commercial defaults based off on wall type, or the other one based on the wall type of the building and thickness, and calculated that way. Depending on the wall type, 2 values can vary, and if you apply 100 millimeter insulation to the wall, the end wall U value will be different due to the different starting value. How is this being presented and educated to people carrying out the upgrades? If the building is to have BER, and if the default U value from SBEM must be used, but if the general upgrades are used, then the calculated value could be used. It'll impact on the efficiency of the building that the building ultimately achieves.
I completely agree. And I mean, I used to be a BER assessor when I was in Ireland, so but I'm about 10 years away from where it's all gotten to. But just from recent EPC SAP kind of feedback, I think it's really, we shouldn't be using it to base our improvements on. But of course, it's the statutory recognised certificate, isn't it, to say here's our retrofit, here's our upgrade. So what we do where we have situations where we need to produce a Section 6 in Scotland or a EPC SAP kind of report in England is also sit the PHPP alongside that, and generally try and take the planners or the statutory persons building warrant in Scotland, for example, along the path of realising where the gaps and weaknesses are, and say, look, here's what we're doing for compliance for your tick the box exercise, but here is the modelled results. But I also agree that there's an information gap there, because architects and design teams just go on a BER and don't know really what they're looking at, isn't really true, isn't a true reflection of the building, and may not know enough about doing proper. That's why we did opening up. We said, oh, we could predict from the SPAB, really good SPAB research by Caroline Roy a couple of years ago, where she went around and they got lots of heat flow construction value U values for lots of different heritage constructions in Scotland. But we also felt like we need to open up, and we were really surprised when we opened up, because things weren't as they seemed at all, and did affect insulation strategy. So I think you've just highlighted another barrier, Stephen, to doing it right, for sure. I think that's a real issue. Yeah.
And it's interesting, just on that U value thing, we've been modeling, using, I would say, in situ modeling of U values. The moisture content of the wall has a massive impact on it, which is again air tightness, and again what ventilation strategy the building's employing itself, which you wouldn't generally think might happen. You mentioned a client, this is David Parr, who's identified a decant school that will be used over the next decade to facilitate the retrofit of nearby schools. Do you know how many schools this will enable to be retrofitted, and what is the greatest distance between the decant school and the furthest school to be retrofitted, i.e. how far do students have to travel?
So, David, I don't know the distance, but there's about 15 schools in that perimeter of that building. That's a big old kind of office, industrial office, kind of 1930s facility. But what I do know is, that's what you're touching on, is that becomes a very political, emotional issue, especially for primary school children, to say to parents and communities, oh, we're going to bring you 1 mile down the road to this other school, which when it becomes a political issue and you get into that governance kind of side of things where decisions need to be made, a local politician won't want you to decant to that school, you know, because that will lose them votes. So you start, even though we're technically trying to save, you know, deal with the climate emergency as well, you deal with other political barriers that get in the way. So they seem to have had a strategy where, as far as I'm aware, the schools are in a few miles. There's an agreement about bus services. They're secondary schools. The initial feedback from this idea, because it hasn't fully started yet, but there's only one project getting retrofitted at the minute, and they're using that decant school, and it's like 500 meters away. Their initial feedback is that for a secondary school, it's going to be a bit easier because, you know, generally students, you know, there's not such a parent focus on bringing kids to and from secondary schools, but the primary schools are going to be a little bit of an issue, I think. And then we have the opposite problem in Edinburgh, where they've actually don't have many spare or empty buildings, because, you know, not many local authorities, well, they shouldn't really have, they should be consolidating and using their assets as best they can. But they are looking at office buildings as close as possible to where the school is as the kind of primary concern. And then if they can't find a decant building beside the school, that may mean that a different approach might be needed for that school, or they move that funding to a school where it has a higher energy use intensity, or just has a closer building to decant to, or they pay the cost of the temporary accommodation. So you can put temporary accommodation up if you have the space, but in some of these urban contexts, you don't have the space to just put them in prefabs for 2 years. And the cost, as I said, can be up to 40% of your overall capital cost for retrofit, can be just the decant, which is insane. You know, you may as well buy your own temporary accommodation as a council and move that around. Maybe that's a solution.
Yeah, it's used quite a lot, you know, just for housing and urban regeneration as well. It can work very well. Next one is just, you know, how many of these buildings have been worked on have been retrofitted, basically, and having feedback from them.
So on the Edinburgh study, some of the big concern was around decant cost on the 12 buildings we did with them. However, some of the sites have a new school being built on the site as part of the consolidation of kind of assets across little boroughs, basically, in the city. So there is 3 have been instructed to go forward as one is full Retrofit, the other 2 is almost Retrofit, you know, everything but basically we think we had to go with kind of decentralized, non-certified mechanical ventilation in one, but essentially everything else is the same, and the air tightness is the same. So they're at rebus stages 3 at the moment, those 3 buildings. One's with another architect and 2 of them are with us. But we've helped establish the retrofit plan for the 3rd project as part of that feasibility. So there's ambition to get on site before next summer, but we'll see how that goes over the next few weeks. So they recognise that actually, let's get some pilots going. Let's see where this goes. They actually got Green Growth Accelerator funding to deliver some of these the initial projects as well. So they've been a very engaged local authority to work with, to just say, right, okay, you know, we're not saying we're rolling it out on 300 buildings, because you know what, they probably aren't. They're probably going to do a mix of heat networks, decarbonisation only, deep retrofit where it can be the most effective, and perhaps kind of middle of the road retrofit. And then they'll look at their whole kind of carbon balance across the estate and know where that benchmark could sit by 2030, because that actually is their target, 2030. But I think this study has kind of proved to them that they'd have to be rolling out, I think there's something like 10 schools across 4 teams each year between now and 2030 to actually get half of the buildings delivered. So, you know, there's an impossibility or a kind of a wider challenge about timescale on these things as well. But yeah, very positive they're going ahead with 3 initial pilots, pre-tender stage.
I have a quick question there, John.
Yeah, please.
Anne-Marie, it's around the costs again, and particularly in Edinburgh. You know, you indicated a target of ideally costs between 50 to 80% of the new equipment, the new build cost for a retrofit. I suppose, is there kind of an accepted threshold, or those I know that not all clients are equally, maybe Edinburgh very good in terms of the embodied element and awareness on that. Are you having any difficult conversations around costs and that new build versus the retrofit kind of challenge, I suppose, from cost perspective?
Absolutely. I mean, everything's gone up 30% since this time last year anyway. So regardless of where we are, budgets aren't where they thought they were going to be. So there's been a discussion with some of the local authorities about what they prioritize in their estate funding, which is meaning some schools might start losing out. The QS, when we started working on this assessment, and worked with 2 different QSs now actually as well, which is quite interesting to see what their take is, because they're all different and they all give very unique responses on situations. His estimate was that the full retrofit was about 90% of the construction cost, which he found a silly construct because it shouldn't be. So when we look at cost per metre squared, we were trying to stay below the SFT cost metric for new builds, which can range between £3,000 to £4,000 per metre squared. So in Scotland, they really fund their education buildings quite well, even compared to England, because the schools are 30% bigger if they're new builds than the English schools. So I'm not quite sure how it relates to the Irish schools, but their pedagogy for teaching is quite different. So when it came to looking at that kind of target estimate, it really depends on, well, if decarbonisation can be 50% of the cost, where can we get to if we have 30%, or 40% of that budget left? And that excludes maybe any, the exclusions I had on the graph. So it might exclude any suitability changes, maybe extensions, or, there's always other interventions to existing buildings to kind of prove their longevity. That cost then needs to be added on as well. So it could end up being slightly more than a new build cost when you look at a retrofit building holistically, i.e. you're dealing with suitability, changing for pedagogy purposes, if it's education building, for example, or adding an extension, or, these other things. So if we can try and keep the kind of retrofit measure, ideally even lower than that, but it's not really feasible in this current climate, I don't think. You have to be realistic and say, well, actually, you know what, retrofit for a whole building brief, not just the energy measure, is probably going to cost more than a new build. But we have, local authorities like the municipality of Barcelona, who and some of the local authorities in London now, where they require you to undertake a very detailed study to justify why you either want to demolish a building or move a building function from its location to a new build or green site somewhere else. But there's also recognition, there's a growing trend or recognition that retrofit is just going to cost more, even if you're not going for a full energy measure. Just existing buildings cost, the capital cost can be more. So in the buildings we've done so far, because we're just looking at the energy measure, we've been able to be mostly below the new build energy metric, within that kind of range that I discussed, depending on the measure that we go with. And again, more investigation needs to go in on that, because obviously every building has its own abnormal. So I would have loved in hindsight to also be a QS as well as an architect, because it's definitely a very dark art. But yeah, it's really interesting to try and get into the granular of it and understand why risk is assigned in these different package pots in different ways, even just between QSs. So I would just recommend that, design teams always try and get a bit more involved in the costing, kind of understand how QSs are coming up with costing, question the costing, try and provide certainty on any areas of risk that they're putting in. And that's why we did the deep dive assessment. We said, right, we're going to try and remove all the risk hypothetically from these buildings by saying we've opened up, we've got all the condition reports, we've done our testing, we've, really surveyed it accurately, we've tried to remove risk. But of course, risk still gets priced in. So, and yeah, long story short, it's a constant conversation, because QSs themselves differ in methodologies, they'll differ in how they divvy up risk. And it's been really interesting, actually, and kind of almost enjoyable trying to understand how they look at buildings, because I think as architects, we should understand really well how QSs look at buildings to be able to help the clients make the right cost decision, because we're responsible for that as well. It's not just the QS.
From there, have you been looking, or will you use the data from the study to inform, say, incremental upgrades of buildings, based on maintenance cycles or end of life? For instance, the commercial building or a non-domestic building in the state, and the windows are at the end of their life. They've only 5 years left.
So with the City of Edinburgh, they had a really significant maintenance bill. I can't quite remember what was off the top of my head, but it was the tune of several million a year just on maintenance and replacement and upgrades of buildings. Some of that budget that's allocated for that is coming across to deal with the retrofit measures, because they're seeing that you can bring some of that OPEX budget into CAPEX to try and minimize the maintenance over the lifetime of the building. And we've only done the analysis with new builds, but for a typical primary school at prior energy costs, so not the current costs that we have. So say a £22 million primary school, if we go on a 60-year profile, so this would be more significant, or you know, a 60-year kind of life cycle cost profile, you're looking at between 80 to 120,000 a year saving, you know, over the life cycle cost of that building. So we're trying to look at how some of that additional extra cost now, and especially if you start applying it to retrofit, has a kind of payback over time, especially then if we revisited that study and said, right, let's put it against spiraling energy costs. You're going to see a return on the extra cost for energy measures earlier. But yeah, again, it's so specific to each building, it's very hard to just do a broad brush stroke on it. But it also highlighted the weaknesses in local authorities on how they even quantify their maintenance, how they stay on top of utility infrastructure upgrades, all those things, or even understand their own estates. You know, so that part of the presentation, come back to understand your own, you know, your public sector estate is so important, because you need to know where the money's going. Otherwise, you know.
Okay. Yeah, Anne-Marie, I'm conscious of people running back to 2 o'clock now. So I'm going to have to curtail this. It's been really good, and we've a poll that you can just shout and open there. Brian, if you could run that just for, if people could just click on the poll and see what you'd like included in the next Spring CPD webinar series. See quite a few things there. Just click the ones that you'd like to see copied. Up to 3.
I was busy there trying to vote, John, and I can't vote, sorry, but yeah.
Hosts and panelists can't vote. Yeah.
I'll let you know later.
Okay, so if you could do that, and just while people are doing that, CPD points are available, and the CPD points have already been issued in relation to the previous webinar. Again, if you go on the webinar or the members site, you're going to have the whole series videos, recordings up there for members of the PHAI, and I think it's going to be a huge resource for everybody. I really would like to thank Anne-Marie. Great to see you back here in Ireland, be it on screen today. Thank you so much. That was really informative, and I think a lot of our local authorities will pick up a lot from this and the whole approach. There's a huge focus at the moment on 2030 and achieving our climate challenges for 2030. It is unfortunately all the climate strategy documents, everything are down renewables, renewables, renewables. The operational and embodied carbon isn't featuring either that or the development plans, and I think it's a huge mistake, really, an oversight, and hopefully they'll be able to pick up like maybe Edinburgh have done to address it. And
I think that sharing across the kind of aisles, as it were, is so important, and you know, I think it can be a real enabler to help across the sea.
We could learn so much. So I think that's it for everybody. Helena, have you anything to add?
No, that's great. Really enjoyed it. And
yeah, it was outstanding. Thanks so much, and thank you on behalf of everybody who attended. See lots of people here talking on the poll. I'm not sure if we want to put it up. I think if you have it, put it up there, Brian. And here we go.
Interesting.
Look at that. Pascal's thermal modeling. Yeah, very interesting.
Good spread.
We might have to call you back on that.
Yeah, happy to go back, and happy if anybody has any, if anyone wants to contribute to any of these studies, you know, do get in touch with John, and yeah, be really interested in any kind of cross-country participation, of course, as well.
This is really informative, Brian. Thank you for organising the poll. We'll look into that now and arrange next spring. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and back to work.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks all. Thanks for organising.
All right. Bye now.
Bye.
Thanks, mate.